Eleanor Whitney pressed her gloved hand against the carriage window, watching the rain lash against the glass as the vehicle rattled along the muddy road leading toward Boston. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd fled Charleston with nothing but a traveling dress, a leather satchel containing forged references, and the desperate hope that distance could wash away everything she'd left behind. The carriage lurched suddenly, throwing her against the seat. Eleanor steadied herself, her heart quickening. The roads were treacherous tonight, and her driver, a kind man named Mr. Hutchins, had mentioned earlier that a storm was brewing over the countryside. She'd heard the warning in his voice, but pressed onward regardless. She always pressed onward. Standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. The 3 years in Boston had been constructed with meticulous care. She'd established herself as a respectable widow, a fiction she'd perfected through careful observation and quiet determination. With the small inheritance she'd claimed, another fiction, she'd rented rooms above a bookshop on Beacon Hill and begun offering lessons in French, music and etiquette to the daughters of merchant families. It was respectable work, safe work, the kind of life that required no explanations and demanded no reckonings with the past. But even the most carefully constructed lives had foundations that could crack. The letter had arrived yesterday, sealed in an envelope bearing a Charleston postmark. Her sister Margaret's handwriting, elegant and frantic all at once, had covered 3 pages with pleas. Their eldest brother had finally succumbed to the consequences of his debts. The creditors were circling. The estate would be seized. Margaret was facing an uncertain future, caught between their brother's failures and their father's rigid refusal to acknowledge the situation. Eleanor had read the letter twice before feeding it to the flames, but the damage was done. The past, it seemed, was not content to remain buried. The carriage slowed, and Eleanor heard her driver's voice outside, raised in greeting. She straightened, smoothing her black traveling dress, and prepared herself for whatever interruption awaited. Likely a farm or an inn, somewhere to wait out the storm. The carriage door opened, and rain rushed inward with the wind. "Beg pardon, ma'am," Mr. Hutchins called, his weathered face creased with concern. "There's a gentleman on horseback. His horse has come up lame, and he's requesting passage to the next town. I've told him we've barely room, but he's insisting, and the storm, well, it's getting worse." Eleanor nodded, though irritation flickered through her. The thought of sharing cramped quarters with a stranger was decidedly unappealing. "Of course," she said, because what else could she say? "We can't leave anyone to the weather." The door widened, and a figure ducked through, bringing with him a gust of wind and rain that sent Eleanor back against her seat. He was tall, impossibly tall for the carriage, and his dark hair was plastered to his face, water streaming down the sharp angles of his cheekbones. His coat was an expensive cut, despite the soaking it had received, and his boots bore the marks of serious riding. As he shook himself dry like some great predatory animal, Eleanor found herself studying him with the analytical eye she'd developed over 3 years of reading people, of learning their secrets and weaknesses. This man was accustomed to authority. It radiated from him as powerfully as heat from a fire. Every gesture, every line of his broad shoulders, it all spoke of a man unused to hearing the word no. He turned to her, and Eleanor's breath caught. His eyes were dark as storm clouds, and there was something in their depths, some mixture of intelligence, determination, and barely contained intensity, that made her pulse accelerate in a way that felt both thrilling and dangerous. "Thank you for your mercy, madam," he said, his voice a deep drawl that immediately placed him as Southern. "Virginia, perhaps, or the Carolinas. My horse threw a shoe 3 miles back, and I fear the beast is suffering more than I am." "You're from the South," Eleanor said, the observation escaping before she could catch it. A smile played at his lips. "Virginia, born and raised. And you, madam, are clearly a woman of perception. May I inquire your name?" Eleanor's training reasserted itself. She lifted her chin slightly, maintaining her composure even as warning bells began to ring in her mind. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitney, I'm traveling to Boston on family business." The man settled himself onto the seat across from her, rain still dripping from his coat. "Nathaniel Ashford, at your service, Duke of Thornfield." He said it without ceremony, as though informing her he was a farmer or a clerk. "I'm traveling to Boston for business as well, though I confess my journey was intended to be significantly more pleasant than this morning's weather suggests." A duke, of course. Eleanor felt her carefully maintained equilibrium shift. Dukes brought complications, they brought expectations and connections, and the very sort of attention she'd spent 3 years avoiding. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance," she said formally, turning her gaze back toward the window. The carriage jolted forward again, resuming its journey through the storm. Eleanor was acutely aware of the man sitting across from her, of the way his eyes seemed to linger on her profile, studying her with the same analytical attention she'd given him. It was unsettling, that sense of being examined. She was accustomed to being invisible, to being the sort of woman people looked through rather than at. But the Duke of Thornfield, she suspected, looked at very few things without truly seeing them. "You're running from something," he said softly, after several minutes of rain-filled silence. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes flashing with anger. "I beg your pardon. I don't say it as accusation," Nathaniel continued, his gaze unwavering. "I simply observe that you have the bearing of a woman who has made peace with solitude. I recognize it, because I've seen it in mirrors." He leaned forward slightly. "So I wonder, Mrs. Whitney, what are you running from?" Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. "I'm running towards something, actually. A quiet life, respectability, peace. All of which you've clearly found," he said, though there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't believe it. "And yet you're leaving Boston on a night like this, for family business, you said." Eleanor turned away again. "I don't see where my personal affairs are any business of yours, Your Grace." The rain continued to fall, and the carriage continued on through the darkness. But Eleanor was supremely conscious of the Duke's presence across from her, of the weight of his attention, of the sense that something had shifted between them in that carriage, something that couldn't be unshifted, no matter how desperately she might wish to escape it. She had run from her past. But as the storm raged around them, and the miles disappeared beneath the carriage wheels, Eleanor began to fear that perhaps the past had finally caught up. The storm didn't break until well after midnight. The carriage pulled into a small inn on the outskirts of a town whose name Eleanor hadn't bothered to catch, and Mr. Hutchins arranged for rooms with an efficiency born of long experience managing difficult travel. Eleanor found herself in a modest but clean chamber on the second floor, a fire burning in the hearth, and a 4-poster bed, promising rest. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in the high-backed chair beside the fireplace and allowed the weight of everything to settle upon her shoulders. The Duke of Thornfield represented everything she'd fled from: southern aristocracy, connections to the very world she'd abandoned, the sort of man who asked uncomfortable questions and likely had the resources to demand uncomfortable answers. A knock came at her door just as dawn was breaking over the landscape. Eleanor opened it to find Nathaniel standing in the hallway. His clothes changed for fresh ones, clearly he'd come prepared for travel, and his dark eyes carrying that same unsettling intensity. "Breakfast is being laid out in the dining room," he said. "I thought you might join me. We have several hours before the roads are clear enough to continue toward Boston." Eleanor considered refusing. She considered every manner of deflection and evasion. But she'd learned in 3 years that the best way to navigate a dangerous situation was often to move directly through it, rather than around it. "Of course," she said, retrieving her traveling shawl. "Give me a moment." 20 minutes later, they were seated across from each other at a small table laden with eggs, fresh bread, and strong coffee. An elderly innkeeper and her husband moved discreetly around them. and Eleanor was grateful for the illusion of privacy their presence created. "You're wondering who I am," Nathaniel said, breaking the silence as he stirred sugar into his coffee. "Not merely my title, but the man beneath it." "I'm wondering," Eleanor replied carefully, "why you're taking such an interest in the personal circumstances of a complete stranger." "Because I pride myself on reading people accurately," Nathaniel said, "and everything about you suggests a fascinating contradiction. You carry yourself with the grace of someone born to society, and yet you hide it beneath the clothing and mannerisms of someone determined to be forgotten. You have cultured speech and refined sensibilities, and yet you present yourself as a widow of modest means. The question, Mrs. Whitney, is whether you're hiding from someone or hiding yourself." Eleanor's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "That's remarkably direct. I find that directness is often more merciful than dancing around truth," he said. "Let me tell you who I am, and then perhaps you'll feel more inclined to return the favor. I am, as I mentioned, the Duke of Thornfield. I maintain estates in Virginia, Kentucky, and Maryland. I'm the product of 4 generations of Virginia aristocracy, and I've spent the last 15 years ensuring that my family's holdings and reputation remain among the most respected in the South." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I am also a man of 37 years with 2 young children, a son of 9 and a daughter of 7, and I've been searching for almost 3 years for a woman suitable not merely as a wife, but as a mother to them." Eleanor felt the breath catch in her throat. "Your Grace—" "I'm not making you a proposal," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "Not yet. I'm simply telling you that my interests are not arbitrary. I came to Boston on business, yes, but primarily to meet with a matchmaker who specializes in connecting Southern gentlemen with Northern women. It seems the women of Virginia have rather firm opinions about my unsuitability as a husband. Given my commitment to my children's welfare," Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. The thought of this powerful man being rejected, deemed unsuitable. It was oddly human, oddly vulnerable. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Don't be," Nathaniel replied. "Their rejections have freed me to recognize what I actually require. I need a woman who understands that love is not always convenient or comfortable. I need someone who can build rather than merely inhabit. I need someone who has known struggle and survived it, because such women understand resilience in a way that pampered daughters of privilege never can." "You're describing someone who doesn't exist," Eleanor said softly. "On the contrary," Nathaniel replied, "I'm describing you." Eleanor pushed back from the table, suddenly unable to sit still. She moved to the window, where the morning light was beginning to touch the landscape, revealing the damage the storm had wrought. Trees lay uprooted, branches scattered across the grounds. "You know nothing about me," she said quietly. "I know that you're frightened," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "I know that whatever you're running from was significant enough to require you to construct an entirely new identity. And I know that despite all your efforts to remain invisible, the moment you look at anything or anyone, you shine with an intelligence and capability that no disguise can fully hide." Eleanor turned back to him. "And what if I told you that the things I'm running from are too dark for a man of your standing? What if the past I've created this life to escape would destroy everything you're trying to build with your children?" "Then I would tell you that I don't ask because I'm not prepared to hear the truth," Nathaniel said, rising from his chair. He moved toward her, his bearing every inch the aristocrat, and yet there was something almost gentle in the way he approached. "I would tell you that I have a measure of power and resources, and that I'm not afraid to use them to protect the people I care for. And I would tell you that whatever you're afraid of, you wouldn't be half as dangerous to my family as your absence from our lives would be." "You can't possibly mean that," Eleanor breathed. "Watch me," Nathaniel replied. He reached for her hand, and Eleanor found herself unable to pull away. "Tell me who you are, Eleanor. Tell me what you're really running from. Let me decide whether I'm still standing here or not." Eleanor looked at the man before her, At the power in him, yes, but also the steadiness, the refusal to flinch from difficult truths. She thought of her sister's letter, of the collapsing estate, of the life she'd tried so carefully to build, and she began to talk. She told him about her family's prominence in Charleston society, about her father's rigid expectations and her mother's quiet resignation, about her brother's debts and the scandal that had followed when creditors began circling. She told him about the man, a neighbor's son with pretensions to genteel poverty, who had insisted on marrying her as a way to unite families and solve financial problems. She told him about her refusal, about the confrontation that had followed, about how that refusal had been perceived as defiance of her father's will. She didn't tell him about the allegations that had followed, about the things the rejected suitor had claimed, the compromises he'd accused her of, the social death that had made remaining in Charleston impossible. Some truths were too dangerous to share with a man she'd met only yesterday, no matter how honest his eyes appeared, but she told him enough. "So I became a widow," she finished quietly. "I built a new name, a new life, a new history. And for 3 years, it's been enough. It's been safe." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been hiding, but hiding is not the same as living." "Perhaps not," Eleanor replied, "but it's been preferable to dying." "What if I could offer you something else?" Nathaniel asked. "What if I could offer you the freedom to simply live, to be whoever you choose to be, without fear of your past reaching out to destroy it?" "How could you possibly?" "Because I have power," Nathaniel interrupted, "and I'm willing to use every ounce of it to protect you, if you'll let me." Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years she felt the carefully constructed walls around her heart begin to crack. They arrived in Boston by late afternoon. Nathaniel arranged for Eleanor to rest at the hotel where he was staying, claiming her as his ward to forestall any gossip about 2 unmarried people traveling together. The lie came easily, protected as it was by his social standing and the simple fact that no one would dare question a Duke of Thornfield. The following morning, Nathaniel sent word that he'd arranged a meeting with Eleanor's sister Margaret. Eleanor's hands shook as she prepared herself, selecting a dress that was neither too fine nor too humble, a balance struck between her old life and her new one. She was terrified, exhilarated, and angry all at once. That Nathaniel had managed to locate Margaret, that he'd taken the liberty of contacting her without Eleanor's explicit permission. It was arrogant. It was presumptuous. It was also exactly the sort of thing a man with resources would do. Margaret arrived at the hotel's private dining room, looking haggard. The 3 years since Eleanor had left Charleston had clearly taken their toll. Their sister had aged in ways that went beyond the merely physical. There was a weariness in her eyes, a resignation in the set of her shoulders. Eleanor stood from her chair, and Margaret rushed forward, pulling her into an embrace that broke something open inside Eleanor's chest. She'd spent 3 years working to forget her family, to sever the threads that bound her to Charleston. But 3 seconds in her sister's arms reminded her exactly why that separation had been necessary. Not because she didn't love them, but because love, when twisted by circumstance and obligation, could be as suffocating as any chains. "I can't believe you're here," Margaret whispered against Eleanor's shoulder. "When this gentleman arrived and told me he had news of you, I nearly fainted. You look so different, Eleanor, so assured." They sat, and Nathaniel, who had politely excused himself, allowed them privacy that Eleanor suspected was meant to be a gift. Margaret filled the silence with 3 years' worth of accumulated news. Father had died 2 years ago. The estate, despite everything, had managed to weather the initial storms, though it would never recover the prominence it had once held. Margaret herself had married a merchant's son, not a love match, but a practical one, and she seemed content enough with the arrangement. "And you?" Margaret asked eventually. "This Duke, Thornfield, he said you've been living in Boston for 3 years, that you've built a respectable life for yourself. Eleanor, What happened after you left? Why did you cut us off so completely? Eleanor considered how much to tell her sister. Some truths, she decided, were better left unsaid. Others had the potential to heal if shared properly. I needed to escape, Eleanor said simply. What was said about me in Charleston, none of it was fair, and all of it was designed to destroy my prospects. Coming north, becoming someone new, it gave me the chance to exist without that burden. Margaret reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. I believe you. God knows I believe you. Father never did. He insisted you'd brought shame on the family by refusing Edmund Carlyle, but I always wondered what the real story was. The real story isn't important anymore, Eleanor said. What matters is that I've built a life, and now something unexpected has happened. This Duke, Margaret said, her eyes widening with understanding. Eleanor, he's taken an interest in you. Eleanor felt warmth flood her cheeks. He's suggested that perhaps I might consider a different sort of future than the one I've been constructing. And you? Margaret pressed. What do you want? It was a question Eleanor couldn't quite answer. She'd spent 3 years defining herself through isolation and safety, through the rejection of connections that might complicate her carefully ordered existence. The thought of stepping beyond those boundaries was both terrifying and tempting. Before Eleanor could respond, Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He entered with the casual grace of a man accustomed to dominating any space he occupied, and he looked at Eleanor with an intensity that made her entire body flush with awareness. Mrs. Whitney, he said formally, though Eleanor heard the warmth beneath his words, I thought you might permit me to speak with your sister alone for a moment, on a matter of some importance. Eleanor looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragement, then withdrew to the outer room. Nathaniel took the seat Eleanor had vacated. Your sister is aware of your circumstances, he said, addressing Margaret directly, and she's agreed to share with you certain facts about my intentions. I won't deceive you. I've known your sister for barely 2 days, but I'm a man accustomed to making assessments quickly, and I've become convinced that Eleanor is precisely what my family requires. More than that, I believe my family might be what Eleanor requires. What exactly are you asking me? Margaret inquired, her protective instincts clearly aroused. I'm asking for your consent, Nathaniel said, to marry your sister, to take her to Virginia, to establish her as Duchess of Thornfield, to entrust her with the welfare of my children and the management of my estates. I'm asking you to trust me with her future. Margaret's eyes widened. You're asking her to marry you? You've known each other for 2 days. I am, Nathaniel confirmed without hesitation. And I recognize how mad that sounds. But your sister ran from an old life because it was no longer bearable. What I'm offering her is not an escape, but a destination. I'm offering her a place where her past cannot touch her and where she can build something meaningful, not alone, but as part of a family. Eleanor stood in the hotel room she'd been given, looking out at Boston spread before her. The city that had been her sanctuary for 3 years suddenly felt small, insufficient. Nathaniel had proposed, formally, and with all the weight of his rank and resources behind the request. And in offering himself and his family, he'd offered something she didn't know she'd been seeking. Not an escape, but a transformation. She'd left Charleston as a woman defined by rejection and scandal. She'd become Eleanor Whitney, respectable widow, through careful construction and deliberate forgetting. But that life had always been temporary, a holding pattern, until she could figure out what came next. And now Nathaniel was suggesting that what came next could be more than mere survival. A knock came at her door. Eleanor opened it to find Nathaniel in the hallway, still dressed in his traveling clothes, his dark eyes carrying that familiar intensity. Your sister has given her blessing, he said without preamble, though she requested I ensure you understood that marriage to me would not erase your past, merely provide you with the resources to manage it on your own terms. Did she? Eleanor murmured, a smile tugging at her lips. Margaret had always been practical. I'm not asking you to answer immediately, Nathaniel continued. "I'm asking you to trust me enough to leave Boston with me, to travel to Virginia, to meet my children, to see what we might build together before you make any final decisions." Eleanor considered the choice before her. She could refuse, could insist on maintaining the careful boundaries she'd constructed around her life. She could send Nathaniel back to Virginia without her, and continue living as Eleanor Whitney, the respectable widow, until her money ran out, or her past finally caught up with her anyway. Or she could take the risk. "I'll marry you," Eleanor said quietly. "Not because I've known you long enough to be certain, but because I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of hiding, and I believe—" She paused, searching his face. "I believe you mean what you're saying." Nathaniel reached out and cupped her face in his hands with surprising gentleness. "I do," he affirmed, "and I swear to you, Eleanor, I will spend every day of our life together proving that I meant it, that you matter, that your children, and yes, they will be your children, will matter, that the life we build will be strong enough to withstand whatever storms come." He kissed her then, and Eleanor felt something shift irrevocably within her. Not a destruction of who she'd become, but a transformation of it. The walls didn't crumble, they simply receded, revealing what had always been behind them: strength, resilience, the capacity to trust again. 3 months later, Eleanor Ashford stood in the gardens of Thornfield Estate in Virginia, watching her new stepchildren play beneath the shade of ancient oak trees. Her son, for James had adopted her heart as completely as any legal document could, was teaching his younger sister Catherine how to properly skip stones in the pond. Their laughter carried across the gardens, bright and uncomplicated. Nathaniel emerged from the house, moving toward her with that distinctive grace that had first caught her attention in a carriage during a storm. He slipped an arm around her waist and drew her against him. "You're happy," he observed, kissing the top of her head. "I'm terrified," Eleanor corrected, though she leaned into his embrace. "Every day I'm terrified that someone will discover who I was, and everything will unravel." "Let them discover it," Nathaniel said calmly. "I have the power to ensure that no Charleston scandal touches this family. Your past is precisely that, past. It cannot define your future unless you permit it to."